Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Repurposing UK Real Estate, Reinventing the Urban Footprint. This is a digital summit with an amazing lineup of speakers, incredible content, and a series of speed networking opportunities throughout the morning. My name's Toby Carling, Business Manager here at Bisnow. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss one of the hottest and interesting topics within real estate right now. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our partners for this event: Callison RTKL, TP Bennett, Gardner and Theobald, Pinson Mason, Venture Project Management, and 10 Design. They've all been incredible with helping us get this event together, and it wouldn't be possible without their support. We have 3 panel sessions today and an additional fireside chat with plenty going on in between. A few tips and tricks for our attendees to help you whilst you're here. You'll be able to interact with the attendees via the right-hand side chat section or ask questions as the conversation moves along. We'd say it's worthwhile staying on that main stage panel session whilst it's running. If you click out of the main stage, you might miss something interesting, and there'll be plenty of time to check out all of the great features of the Excel Events platform either side of the sessions. Don't worry about taking notes either. All of these will be recorded and available on demand within an hour after each session ends. If you experience technical difficulties at any point, please use the information desk. It's in the middle of the lobby page to troubleshoot, or give us a shout out in the chat function. A Bisnow team member will get back to you as soon as possible. It's fine if you're watching from your phone right now as well. However, the best way to view and use this software is via your laptop or desktop. So if you have any problems, give that a try. The Expo Hall is also a great place to visit during today. Network with the sponsors, go say hello, please explore this. It's really easy, just click that Expo floor button on the left-hand side of your screen. For the speed networking between sessions, please ensure you use your camera plus the microphone in order to truly take advantage and meet fellow attendees. We're all Zoomers here now, so this should be second nature, but don't forget to press connect and send over your virtual business card if you want to follow up with a formal meeting after that 3-minute chat. We're all here to do business at the end of the day. Our partners for our first session of the day are 10 Design and Gardner and Theobald, who have been invaluable in creating the content of this session. This session is called Master Planning and Partnerships, Meeting New Demands Through Development and Transformation. Just to our attendees as well, we'll have a pop-up of a poll during this session too. Please do answer it. It'll provide you with the rest of the audience's responses as well. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Kat Hanna, Master Plan Strategist at Lendlease, Nalin Seneviratne, Director at City Centre Development at Sheffield City Council, Nick Cox, Partner at Gardner and Theobald, Chris Jones, Partner at 10 Design, and our moderator, Zoe Green, Urban Planning and Development Lead at PwC. Zoe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Toby. Pleased to have this session this morning to get us all started for the day. And so to kick off the discussion, I just want to lead with this reflection. The pandemic has shown us the wider social importance of the built environment. So how do we embed principles of sustainability, well-being and inclusivity? Who would like to go first on this very important question?
I'm happy to have a go. So thanks, Zoe. So just for a little bit of context, so I'm working specifically on the Euston Master Plan for Lendlease. So that's a 60-acre site, Zone 1 London, and primarily kind of catalysed by obviously the HS2 terminus arriving at Euston. And I think obviously, you're really right to acknowledge, the kind of the focus that we now have on sustainability, wellness and inclusion. But I think it's also worth saying, these priorities aren't new. We have known this all along. There is no doubt that the pandemic has, I think, kind of thrown them into quite stark relief. And also, I think, because for a lot of us individually, there are things we've also experienced, issues like, open to outdoor space, or thinking about, the stability of employment of ourselves and our loved ones. So it is something that I think we are very much focused on. I think our perspective, at Euston really has actually been, thinking about actually listening and understanding people's lived experiences, particularly, over the past, what's coming up for over a year now, and recognizing that not everyone has had the same experience. This idea that the pandemic is the great leveler really isn't necessarily the case, and it has impacted people really differently. So it has to begin to really listening and understanding to what that experience is before we start thinking about how do we respond.
Thank you, Kat. Who would like to go next on this?
If I could just kind of add on to that, I completely agree, Kat. And listening to stakeholders, and in particular communities where we're building, is very important. At Brent Cross Town, for example, there was kind of concern in the local community about taking away kind of valuable green space and park space, and this is obviously kind of pre-pandemic as well. And there's kind of decisions and scenarios to kind of look at in terms of bringing forward kind of non-revenue generating infrastructure in terms of green space. And we took decisions to build green space kind of before we did anything else to kind of quell the concern of the local community and help put something in place first for the beneficial use of everyone, rather than kind of as an afterthought. Once we kind of built kind of new apartments, flats, commercial, retail, etc., we're giving back to the community is the first and foremost thing that we do. So yeah, listening to, I completely agree, Kat. So similarities there.
Thanks. Nalin, can you reflect on the Sheffield experience around this?
Yeah, sure, Zoe. I think just echoing what Kat and Nick were just saying, I think the sort of pandemic has made us maybe put a value what we were doing before more than we appreciated it before. So it was probably always a bit more of an argument pre-pandemic, when we were thinking about, you know, better space planning, green space, better public realm, etc. It was always, well, hang on a minute, that's costing too much. But now that argument's flipped, and we now are starting to value that, and we're also, you know, that's going to start to feed into how we look at just the, you know, the actual built environment and spaces like food and beverage, for example, which will all now value having the ability to have chairs and tables outside, and linking that to green space. So that's the sort of thing that we're finding in Sheffield. And you know, we've got one of the greenest cities in the UK, where, you know, a big third of our city area is in the Peak District National Park, which people forget. And we've always made strides to make better linkage of the national park into the city centre. But that's now become a real focal point. And, you know, we were pre-pandemic, we were already turning redundant road space into green space. And people might have questioned that before, but now people are saying, yeah, let's do more of it, you know. And our current plans around better connecting Sheffield through the Transforming Cities Fund is all about doing exactly that. Thank
you. And Chris, do you have any further reflections?
Yeah, I would echo that this whole, it's nothing new, as Kat said. I mean, I think we've used this word a lot in the last year and a half of accelerant, or it's just increased the trajectory of the conversations we've been having as designers and clients and developers for many years. And it's welcomed in some ways in terms of the pace at which and the importance and the significance that we're placing on the built environment. We recently in Edinburgh, where we just secured planning for a mixed use development in the new town. It's all about those elements of connectivity, of the access to the green amenity of a permeable site, but of protective, secure public space that is fully accessible, but equally has to work a lot harder than it used to. And that we want now, the issues of inclusivity and the demands placed on public realm, and having multiple programs to sustain lots of different activities and spaces is absolutely fundamental. Our public realm needs to work a lot harder. We've all worked a lot harder in the last year and a half, and I think that's reflected in the built environment, and it's really exciting to see that accelerant.
Thank you, Chris. So there's a lot of discussion about the way the pandemic may impact the market and how the built environment sector, some of the key development areas may change and flexes in demand. And it's important to understand that there's going to be sort of a flexibility about how we can actually respond to these changes. How can public and private partners work best together on this?
So shall I pick that one up, Zoe? Given that we, as a city council, are at the moment acting as a major developer with our Heart of the City project in Sheffield, I think I'd like to put it along the lines that we're working with a model where the city council, the public sector, is actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting around development, where maybe even current trends don't suit a traditional development appraisal. There are too many costs involved, and equally the cost of doing extensive and high quality public realm all puts a dent in the traditional appraisal. So we're carrying those costs, but we've got the ability to deal with those over a very long time horizon. In our case, we're spreading that cost over 40 years. Now, traditional development doesn't do that. That's about short-term, 3 to 5 year return. But the funds are in that same position. So some of the institutions that actually will fund development are in a position to take a long-term view. And I think the appraisal model that we all are used to working with at the moment is going to have to change somehow. What the answer is, I don't quite know at the moment. I think, we're dealing with just a sheer issue of cost versus value, but we're going to have to end up, I think, over the next couple of years with a different model. And what I mean by that is that the public sector is not always going to be able to just keep carrying this cost. We've got to end up with a different way of assessing value on projects. And some of the issues that, again, probably accelerated through the pandemic are the sorts of deals that retailers and food and beverage operators are now wanting to do, much more on a turnover basis, and therefore that affects investment yield. Also, you've got to look now at doing much more of the fit out or white boxing units for operators. So that brings on board an additional cost. So I think on one hand, it shows that the demand is still there, but the way of financing that demand and dealing with it is changing, and we're all going through that change at the moment. And because we're in the middle of delivery, we are having to deal with that and deal with that over a long-term period of 40 years in our case.
I think if I could add as well, maybe from a kind of how we're thinking about some of the design challenges that we have at Euston. I guess at Euston we have the added complexity that obviously quite a lot of what we're delivering is above or very close to station or tracks. So you have this, ongoing challenge in the project, I guess, between the need for flexibility and we have, we're very lucky, I think, in having a local authority that very much recognises that and recognises that, the best possible master plan is one that offers that flexibility further down the line, but at the same time needing to provide a degree of fixity, because obviously, if you're thinking about putting in, piling, cores, and a lot of this, earlier on, we again need to make sure we've given ourselves the kind of best possible foundations on which to deliver those plots at a later date as well. And then I think sort of going back to the first question that we were talking about, it's also about understanding, well, what do we know isn't going to change? As master planners, we're all used to dealing with uncertainty and long timescales. Again, this isn't new. So what do we know are going to be those enduring priorities? And a lot of that, again, goes back to quality open spaces at the heart and at the master plan, thinking about permeability in routes and spaces and how people will be drawn in and wanting to use that. Or again, how we can maybe prioritize and bring some of those forward early so local communities can start benefiting from them sooner rather than later. So it's, again, what do we know is going to be really important, almost kind of regardless of kind of the fundamental shift that we've seen in the past year, but then also recognizing what are some of the decisions that we do need to make now to guarantee that flexibility later on.
I think it's an interesting point. We've noticed with our corporate clients who have obviously commercial tenants looking to rent space in properties, and this is international, it's not unique to the UK, but I don't think it's a trend. I think it's an increased focus, or at least I hope it is, and that is on wellness and specifically on air quality. And the fact that what's happening now is there's demands from the tenant, from the end user, about quality, the quality of the space and the wellness that the client and us ultimately as designers can design and provide. I think that will be an increased focus. I think it's welcomed. I think it's obviously been accelerated again by the pandemic. And that goes hand in glove with other passive measures of design, encouraging mobility through a building and through a master plan, staircases and ramps that actually promote, in the main desire lines, so that you're not reliant on mechanical transit, but you can actually encourage this mobility and sense of wellness in these environments. I think that's a fundamental increased focus, and not, I would add, a trend, I would hope.
Nick, do you have any sort of further reflections around the sort of private-public partnership working, or the need for flexibility around this?
Yeah, well, just to pick up from a cost point of view of flexibility, I think there's kind of naturally that kind of some change that we're going through at the moment will alter kind of landscapes of master plans, but there's others that will perhaps fade away. And I think just to pick up on kind of the elements of fixity, that's important to kind of ring fence, so we know what is certain, and there's only so much flexibility in terms of cost you can build into master plans, because otherwise you kind of go back to kind of viability issues within the financial models. And I think, just to touch on Naren's point about kind of traditionally, I'm involved with kind of private developers, and its master plans are driven by kind of rent yields and values, and it's the kind of upfront spend of infrastructure is pretty dead cost, and it's how we can start working together to try and unlock some of the potential of some of the infrastructure required in order to then facilitate kind of what we need to facilitate in terms of kind of the infrastructure, green open space, etc. So that's what I'd add on that.
Thank you. Just touching on that further, Nick, to what extent might potential conflicts exist around this? For example, unlocking this potential, who is responsible for sort of driving this forward? Is it public? Is it private? Is it a mixture? How are we going to sort of see this change happen sooner?
I think it's certainly a mixture, and I think the things like the Levelling Up Fund will go a long way to unlocking and help regenerate town centres, city centres, in infrastructure required to unlock potential of various parcels of land across the UK. I think one of the things we've kind of been heavily involved with for the last year is just retesting assumptions around master plans. When there's kind of economic anxiety, that always brings a level of kind of retesting financial models, for example, and what do we mean by kind of cost effectiveness? Is that less upfront spend, but potentially more overall spend? And a lot of kind of private developers, kind of infrastructure will be triggered by kind of pre-lets, for example, to then for the developers to have certainty to deliver the infrastructure required to enable certain plots. But I think it's a mixture, and perhaps there needs to be some thinking about how kind of funding mechanisms, kind of public-private partnership work to start to think about delivering and unlocking some of this.
I think there's a point about ultimately what are the risks involved and who's best placed to bear those risks, and subsequent benefits, and what different benefits will come off, bearing particular risk types. So for example, if we take what Nick has just been talking about and just say there's a big gap in the appraisal because there's a whole load of infrastructure that needs to be put in place, well, maybe that's where the public sector does need to look at that, because ultimately the long-term benefits that might arise from the scheme in terms of the sort of health and well-being things we've been talking about, but fundamentally jobs as well in the economy, there is, that's where the long-term view from the public sector can play a big part, because those are the benefits it's realizing, and the private sector is managing its risk and realizing its own benefits in terms of risk, reward for that risk and profitability and so on and so forth. So there's I think what we've got to do is find a better way of working together. Yes, there are these funds coming forward and so on and so forth, but ultimately they're still fixated on very traditional models, and not to say we can't make those traditional models work. We can, and we do, but but I think there is, I think over the next couple of years we'll find a better way of working together. So we're doing it already, but I think there's a better way where we're doing it more in true partnership than just, here's a slug of money, you get on with it, or you just take all the risks sort of, attitude to life. And I think we'll realize that between the private sector and the public sector generally, that in order to fix things here, we've got to work together in a better way.
I think just to pick up on Nalan's point, I think a lot of our focus has really been about how do we understand and kind of communicate what the long-term benefits, of investment can be. And again, one of sometimes the challenges obviously we have at Euston is in many ways it's regarded purely as, an infrastructure or a rail project. But actually what we've been very focused on, and we were quite, involved in submissions to the Oakervie review, was to actually making sure we're not underrepresenting all the economic and social benefits that can actually come, when that sort of investment takes place. So again, that's, obviously we've mentioned job creation, but again, also what that means in terms of impact on people's quality of life, again, improved public realm, not just necessarily thinking about, connectivity benefits in maybe that slightly kind of narrower aspect. So it's really about thinking of almost how do we value some of those things, and often kind of what's in and what's out of some of those investment appraisal decisions that happen.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of the value, are we sort of seeing more emphasis around ESG, sort of the net zero agenda, climate positive design? Are you sort of seeing this demand, and how are you sort of responding to this?
I think, it depends, I guess, who we're talking from. I think particularly, if we're looking at, on the private sector investment side of things, I think absolutely, in terms of, alignment with ESG. And I think also thinking on a broader level, maybe about trends, about, attracting people, back to the workplace, or why actually now, as a large company, would I invest in what could be a very expensive, bit of real estate? And it's because it needs to really align with those company values. It needs to speak to actually what people want to feel part of, where they feel they want to belong. So actually, there were some recent surveys done recently with employees saying they would not work for a company that didn't have net zero real estate. So actually, I think increasingly it's just become something you absolutely need to do from the get-go, with everything else then kind of becoming, an additional to that. So absolutely that demand is there. Again, I think that's something that's become accelerated rather than something that kind of didn't exist before. And, I think a lot of developers are now just kind of embedding that, obviously thinking how to embed that into, for example, our costing when we're thinking about, materials, when we're also thinking about the operation of those assets too.
I think also there's a limited tolerance for a lack of control in the spaces that we design and the buildings that we have. There's this independent, or rather there's this pent up demand to actually have, individual control of your workspace, and whether that be to do with how you partition off an office floor, how adaptive and responsive and flexible the communal spaces and amenity spaces are, to actually your ability to open a window rather than have a hermetically sealed conditioned box. And obviously that's more prevalent in other parts of the world than UK. But this kind of self-control or ability to control your environment is another thing that goes hand in glove with net zero, I would say. And it's welcomed, this increased almost democracy of use and your intimate relationship with the built environment is key.
I think even as a public sector, we're recognizing that through our, even as developer, because within the Heart of the City scheme, we were already working to LEED standards and BREEAM standards, but we've gone further now with the development of probably the region's first net zero carbon office building, where you can open the windows. And it's like, wow. So and that's just started on site, and we're actually building it speculatively as well, because going back to Nick's point about developers waiting for pre-lets, we took a view here that there's a certain amount of momentum that needs to carry on, and by actually building a product such as a net zero office building, it will sell. That demand is there. We're getting a feel for that demand. Therefore, we thought we'd get on with it rather than just wait and wait and wait.
Good. So in terms of looking post-pandemic, are we sort of seeing any long-term shifts, any long-term changes in terms of behaviour? Sort of we briefly mentioned around sort of working patterns, you know, how some companies have come out and said, you know, we only expect you in the future 2 to 3 days in the office. How will that impact on some of those retail environments around those offices? And how will our sort of cities, urban areas sort of change fundamentally? Are we seeing any noticeable patterns of change?
Yeah, I'm picking up some of those patterns just now. So before the pandemic, we were receiving inquiries from firms wanting to take X number of floors. Okay. The same firms are still there wanting space, but now they're talking about, you know, 50 to 70% of that original requirement, which is fine in many ways, because, you know, again, the way we're designing the building, that can be multi-let and so on. And so we'll let it to 2 companies as opposed to 1 sort of thing. But we are starting to see that. And I think that also then links to the deals that we're having to do with retailers that, as I said earlier, are moving to a sort of turnover base. So I think those trends, we're seeing those now with the developments that we're doing.
I think to add to that, I mean, I think really it's more, I guess, how it's informing some of the decisions that we're making. And I think, you know, the idea that you would design a large piece of real estate primarily just for one kind of group of people to occupy for a set period, kind of 9 to 5. And we've talked before about the importance of how hard kind of space really needs to work now. You know, right now it seems kind of unthinkable. You know, we've seen that it's mixed use assets and development that have performed best throughout, you know, the pandemic, and it's, you know, it's kind of easy to see why. So again, for us, it's been reaffirming, well, how do we deliver spaces that aren't just going to be great for employees there who might be there 2 days a week, 9 to 5, but actually for local students, for local communities, for families at the weekend, for someone who's taking a Tuesday afternoon off because they want to go and meet a friend or visit a museum. So thinking about all these changes and flexibilities of people's own routines, and actually really being able to offer choice that I think reflects some of that flexibility too. So if anything, I think it's actually quite an exciting opportunity. I mean, I think we are lucky in that we're obviously at relatively early stages, so we can plan in for this mixed use now. Obviously, there is the harder question of where you have those kind of legacy areas of kind of quite monotonous land use and how they might adapt. That is obviously a little bit more challenging.
I think also on that, just going back to the sort of inequality issues thrown up by the pandemic, what we've done with our Heart of the City scheme on a particular element of it is actually made it a requirement that tenants actually pay the real living wage, in terms of real living wage, the living wage foundation rates, not the national living wage. And again, because as a public authority, we're investing into this scheme. We're taking the development risk. We thought it was only right that we should try and enhance those overall values and make sure that what we are delivering is also good quality jobs. And coming back to that, you know, how that plays into the health and wellbeing agenda. So it's just an interesting thing. And actually, we haven't received, interestingly, we haven't received much objection to that. So again, I think that probably plays into the ESG roles that companies are having to look at, and you know, we'll all end up with hopefully a better position overall.
And I think that's a really important point, because I think as developers, we will fail if we only look at how do we make sure our grade A offices respond to these changes. If it's just about, you know, having amazing air quality in a building, but actually everyone else, all those when they're getting to the building, are experiencing low air quality, that doesn't work. If it's only those employees who are using that space that are benefiting from the investment that's happening, again, we haven't really thought about how that place is working for everyone. So I think that point about thinking how everyone has benefited from that investment is really important.
I think this notion of mixed use is key, because obviously it supports multiple demographics and a very diverse range of people accessing a project, particularly if it has public realm in it, obviously. But equally, this almost enhanced tactical urbanism of supported spaces that can allow pop-up retail, farmers markets at weekends, and then more maybe corporate events and stuff during the weekdays when the offices are, you know, like these spaces have to support and sustain and endure a lot of different multiple programs throughout the working week and throughout the weekend. And and products and projects that have that inbuilt will be more resilient ultimately. And we're very rarely are we now designing as master planners and architects for a single demographic.
And that programming point is that Chris has talked about is really important. If you think back to the issue of inclusivity, I think there was an example of the New York High Line where, you know, it was a particular sort of maybe middle class demographic or whatever that was enjoying that space, yet the route went through one of the most deprived areas of New York City. And it was only when and people, you know, people from those backgrounds were not using that space. It wasn't theirs. And it was only until the operators of the High Line realized that and started to look at programming of events that included those communities. In fact, getting those communities to actually manage those events and become part of the team did the whole thing become more inclusive. And I think those are lessons to be learned like that from elsewhere, which again wasn't anything to do with the pandemic. It was an issue that just needed dealing with. And but these are the things that I think we can look at to other places and realize the importance of that programming, and it's things like that that will drive inclusivity, not just having the public space. It's about what we do with that public space and how we engage people with it.
And that flips the whole kind of positivity of new development. And obviously people are cautious, particularly in our UK cities where heritage is very precious and we're very proud of it, and our, you know, our history is deep and ingrained in our, you know, in our cities. The ability to actually say yes to something, to see the advantage, and to feel that you will get benefit as an individual on that development. We were talking the other day to colleagues who mentioned acronym that I hadn't heard before, which was YIMBY rather than NIMBY, which was yes in my backyard. You know, yes, give me a mixed use development that I can go to at weekends with my kids and do stuff. And then, you know, there's increased positivity and the community strengthens and the whole city benefits. So I think that's really, really powerful and to be applauded.
And I think that point about engagement and when it happens in the process is really important. You know, we talked at the beginning of the session about, you know, listening to the community. And again, it's actually understanding, well, not just about where public realm is located, but it's also, well, again, what activities might be provided for, how would it be programmed, how would it be lit, you know, and making sure we're really, you know, the people who know their area best are the ones who have lived there for years. They're the local authority who have managed those spaces for years. So really making sure we begin with listening and not necessarily, you know, assuming that we know best. And, you know, one of the really interesting pieces of work we've done at Euston was working with some local young people to understand where are areas where they would choose to kind of hang out in their spare time and where are those they wouldn't. And some of the nuances that they brought that we didn't necessarily ourselves think about spaces that might feel welcoming but didn't particularly feel safe, or those where they felt safe but they maybe didn't really feel they were welcome there because it maybe felt a bit too nice, or the shops were a bit too expensive. No one else there really sort of looked like them and they didn't really feel that they belonged. These are perspectives that we ourselves can't do. And that's, again, back to that point of why listening and partnership is going to be really important to bringing these places forward.
So how then do we better integrate not just the existing community, but also those future communities? You know, how can we sort of plan effectively, you know, going forward?
I think for us, it's really ensuring that it's an interesting question. How do you plan for the future communities? I think the point is making sure that our public realm is of a quality and a status that's long lasting, deals with accessibility issues, makes the right linkages across different communities. So again, you know, we're looking at how we are improving walking and cycling routes and so on. I mean, these are the things that, you know, as human beings, whatever happens to motorized transport, you know, we are here able to get across our areas. So it's making the links, having the quality of space that I think will be enduring into future generations.
You're right. I think it's about having a space to dwell. You know, this conscious thing, particularly in landlocked, you know, city centre urban developments. Often it's just about getting through a space, from one point A to point B, rather than actually recognizing, this oasis of calm, often that has, buildings around the perimeter. So perhaps the acoustics are softer. Perhaps, the noise and the drama of a city and the buses and cars is drowned out by the bird song. And, some thinking about the quality of the space that you want to dwell in, and therefore, maybe go and buy a coffee or go to a gaming shop if you're a teenager, and what you can do in that space so that it's programmed correctly. But ultimately, it's down to creating beautiful spaces that are resilient and good quality, and places that you want to spend time in, safe and secure.
I think I'd add to that as well. I think it's the importance of providing for flexibility and choice. So whether it's we're thinking about workspace or thinking about a residential offer, being able to offer a mix of product, and that's not necessarily just about different price points, but that's also different tenure models as well that can actually reflect different ways in which people are going to be working and living, but also actually can evolve alongside people's own trajectory. So that might, for example, be, we talked about pop-up spaces. That might be, accommodating a new food startup who can then grow and later on move into a permanent place. We've had brilliant examples of where that's happened in our project in Elephant Park. Or similarly, it might be seeing someone, progress from, a shared ownership home and then maybe moving on, or, starting with build to rent, moving on to ownership, so really providing that choice and reflecting, that, necessarily that linear pattern that we maybe thought was the case, a few years ago, that's changing a lot more now. And I think the more you can respond to that, the more you will be able to, I think, offer something for future communities. I think the danger that we probably face now as a sector is probably listening to any one voice that says, the future of X is Y. I would argue anyone that's saying that is probably got a bit of an agenda or a product to sell if they're saying it with, with so much certainty. So I think making sure we don't get too locked into one specific model or product.
I think also just linking this back to the sort of question of master planning, with our scheme in Sheffield, we, probably 20 odd years ago, were in the mode of delivering one enormous, massive retail, shopping mall. And that now, thank goodness we didn't deliver that. And it was four or 5 years ago now, we decided, you know what, hang on a minute, as recognizing that the world was changing, we decided that we would build on the existing street pattern, that we would build on a block by block basis, which also provides not only the flexibility now, but the flexibility for the future. So if a particular building, for whatever reason, is no longer fit for purpose in 20, 30 years time, it's a lot easier to knock that down or recycle it somehow within that plot without having to affect the whole area, which is what we're now seeing with some of the legacy developments from the 1960s and 70s and even early 80s, where there are towns and cities up and down the land. I know I'm talking to some of my counterparts in other places where literally they're scratching at their heads looking at these, big blocks, thinking, what on earth do we do with this? And knocking it all down again from an environmental perspective, you start to question yourself because of all the embedded carbon. So some of those legacy developments are a real problem now. And I think for the future, and to again answering your question about future proofing, it also comes down to a more modular approach to development that allows for that flexibility in the future.
I think that's right, Alan. I think, Kat, you made a really good point there earlier as well about the fact that if anyone's cocksure about something right now, they're probably wrong. We're all wrestling with doubt and anxiety about how we deal with all of this, and we won't be able to deal with it fully until we're out of it. It's like having a post-occupancy report done on a building. You don't know how it's going to perform until you've actually lived and worked in it. So I think what's a definite is pre-pandemic formulas for adjacencies and space, analysis won't work. What will work is a tolerance and an acceptance of having a level of agility and questioning ideas and being able to deal with several different conflicting ideas and having a consensus or having a quorum of people that can bring all those different threads to the table. And that's about collaboration, public and private. It's about engaging as many stakeholders as you can to influence the decisions and bring all that experience to bear on navigating our way through what is a very uncertain future.
Thanks, Chris. Nick, can you reflect on the things around sort of quality of space and existing in future communities from your perspective on some of the projects that you're doing at the moment?
I think from my perspective, it's just what we do in the master plan from a public realm point of view, from commercial space, retail space, resi spaces. What we do is to help the community grow, to ensure their futures. So encouraging independent retailers, kind of startups, and give them the opportunity to kind of grow the community. Possibly family businesses kind of spawn out of startups and kind of startup retail space. And it's trying to unlock mechanisms that we can kind of support them in doing that. And I know Niall is kind of mentioned about revenue-based rents and perhaps kind of longer rents that are kind of a lower rental, just to help support those communities. So I think the flexibility ultimately comes from the stakeholders and the people that live in the space and helping them to support and grow, essentially.
Just looking in terms again at the future, what's the role of technology around this? Do we need to be doing more? Do we need to be doing less? How can we integrate it, and how can we make sure that we sort of keep with this sort of flexible approach that we've been talking about on this call?
I think to kick off again, it's probably, you know, it's not massively different from a general approach to master planning, which is again, you know, what's the kind of essential infrastructure, you know, we need to have in there. How are we thinking about, you know, additional capacity and for, you know, additional demand, you know, that may come forward. But I think most importantly is making sure, again, we're focusing on, you know, technology for a purpose or for a reason. You know, I think I'll try not to go on one of my normal rants about smart cities, but there is often, you know, a bit of a tendency to talk about being, you know, the most smart, the most technologically advanced, the most connected, without actually saying why and the benefits that it actually could bring for people in their daily lives. You know, what does it mean for a building to be efficient? You know, efficiency is only good if I'm kind of able to do something with that time or energy or money saved. So it's also about how we communicate the benefits of that technology. You know, I think, you know, Chris earlier talked about people wanting to kind of understand and get to know their buildings a bit better. So I think, yes, we are going to see more of that. And, you know, technology and data can play a really valuable role in that, but it needs to be serving that bigger purpose of, for example, reducing your energy footprint. So I think it's again about setting what's the challenge or the priority that we want to achieve, and then what role can technology play amongst many other, you know, and technology in the broader sense, you know, what role can it play in, I think, helping us achieve that?
I think there's two sides to that, isn't there, Zoe? Maybe one which is how does digital technology impact the design process, and then how does it ultimately impact the built environment? I mean, speaking to the design process, it's you know, in the 20 years that I've been an architect, it's had a huge impact in the influence of how we look at design iterations, in that we can share with clients so many more iterations than we could historically, because we're still drawing, you know, we're still using our pens, but ultimately in the computer technology and the technical platforms that are available to all of us, you can look at so many different financial and architectural outcomes that you can test and model at such a greater frequency than you could before. I mean, Nick will speak to this as well. So you can actually give a client, you know, a more surety about the impact of the decisions that are being made by them and their design team. So that's exponential in terms of how that has, you know, digitization has affected us as an industry. And I think to the built environment, I think this, you know, the ability to monitor buildings and people, not in a aggressive, you know, not in a fearful way, but actually in terms of density and population and how to protect, you know, and make these spaces secure. There's so much more availability now about how we can manage our cities and our flow through cities and redirect and disperse, which is going to be probably a fundamental issue moving forwards through the pandemic.
Thank you, Chris. And now handing back to Toby, I'm conscious of time.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for today. That was an amazing session. To our attendees, it's now time for a quick 30-minute break. Go see our sponsors in the expo floor, go get stuck into the speed networking, and we'll see you all at 10:45 back on the main stage here. Thank you so much.